Come on up, Neil. In a piece of brilliant choreography, I'll just slightly foreshadow Neil's speech by saying one thing I love about him is he actually is the odd man out, as it were, on this panel, because he's actually a historian. So let's hear what he has to say from that perspective.
Yes, I'm a historian who really enjoys hearing great economists diss economics, as George Akerlof just did. I'm going to go even further because I'm not an economist at all. I didn't submit or pre-circulate a paper for this conference, as some of you may have noticed, to make a point. And the point is that books are much more important than papers. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the book that I've published already this year in the UK, which will be published later this year in the US, in order to try to make a simple point that when you economists are assessing the value of one another's work, you do something which you have long neglected to do, namely attach importance to books, significantly more importance to books than you currently do. Keynes issued a very famous warning, which is very apposite here. The ideas of economists and political philosophers are more powerful than is commonly understood. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. We should do well to remember that, but we also need to consider the possibility that economists and indeed political philosophers are the slaves of some defunct historian. It's very striking to me in the wake of the financial crisis that there has been something of a rush on the part of economists to do more economic history, most successfully in the case of my colleague Ken Rogoff and indeed Carmen Reinhardt's great book, This Time is Different, less successfully in other cases when crude historical judgments have been made, for example, about the causes of the financial crisis. I think you, as a profession, need to do better. And you need to do better history. And I'm going to make a few suggestions about how that might be done in the context of the topic of this panel. As you all know, and as has already been pointed out by George, very few economists anticipated what some have called the third Great Depression. I think it's not quite great, it's more a slight depression. But however you judge it, it's a depression that few anticipated. The question I want to ask is whether we can do any better in anticipating a third world war. World wars are about as frequent as depressions, and their infrequency makes them very hard to foresee. The sample size is small. But what we clearly need to do, if new economic thinking is to have any value, is to stop treating wars as exogenous shocks. I remember being shocked when I realized that to most economists, wars were exactly that, exogenous shocks like meteors hitting the Earth. And I want to suggest this evening that that's the wrong way to think about conflict. And if you do think about conflict that way, your economics is going to be strangely unhistorical. It's only going to really be about peacetime. As this chart illustrates, peace is not a very common thing in human history. This is based on a very famous data set by an Englishman named Richardson, who wanted to analyze the statistical incidence of deadly conflict. And it plots the duration of war on the x-axis in quarter centuries from 1800 to 1950 against the magnitude of war, the base 10 logarithm of the number of deaths. I've circled the two world wars because they're outliers, and their very existence poses a very major problem for most optimistic accounts of human history. It's very puzzling indeed that the most violent encounters of human history happened in the middle of the 20th century after a very great deal of economic progress had been made, and very few theories have been produced that adequately explain that seeming aberration. We all, I think, would acknowledge that inequality within societies in our time, let's say since the 1970s, has been on the increase. I could show you any number of charts to make that point, but you've probably seen them before, so I won't dwell on it. One important point that has been raised in more than one of the sessions today has to do with the impact of rapid economic growth on the so-called BRIC economies, but in fact it's true of emerging markets as a whole. There's been a significant increase in inequality. Take China, which now has a Gini coefficient not much lower than Brazil. Some would even estimate that it's up there with Brazil already. That's a pretty important phenomenon, I think, for us to think about. What does it mean? At the same time as inequality has been increasing within societies, it's been diminishing very rapidly in international terms. This chart takes Angus Maddison's great data set of per capita GDP, and it calculates two ratios. US to China, that's the blue chart, the blue line, and UK to India, the red line. And it goes right back to 1500, and it shows you, and this is the central theme of my book, Civilization, that most of history from 1500 was a history of divergence. And then suddenly, starting in the late 70s, there was extraordinarily rapid reconvergence between West and East. I want to suggest to you that most of you have two assumptions about inequality in your minds that are derived from defunct historians. The first is that domestic inequality leads to instability, probably political instability. And you got that idea because you vaguely remember articles or books by historians like Ernest Labrousse on the French Revolution or Leopold Heimsen on the Russian Revolution. Your other assumption is that international equality can lead to conflict, by which I mean if there is a closing of the gap between an established power and a rising power, you might incline to think that that would lead to conflict. If you do think that way, it's because you remember Paul Kennedy's book, The Rise of Great and Fall of Great Powers, or maybe have read John Mearsheimer's most recent work, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. I think these assumptions are out there because although economists despise history as a general rule, they can't help knowing a little. I want to offer some qualifications to assumptions A and B and then a few brief conclusions. It's not actually always the case that social inequality, that rising inequality leads to conflict. There are lots of things that can mitigate that, even if a society becomes really quite significantly less equal than it's been in the past. If people experience or believe in social mobility, they'll be less upset by inequality. That's a feature of the United States. If a regime has a great deal of legitimacy, as say in China today, people will suffer surprising amounts of inequality. If people are old, they'll put up with inequality. In conditions where religious or, let's say, cultural ideas legitimize inequality, as for example in India, people will tolerate a good deal of inequality. That's why you can walk through the streets of Indian cities at night, which you wouldn't dare to do in the streets of South American cities. And ethnic homogeneity also mitigates the effects of social inequality. Conflict enhancers are social rigidity, when you know that you're stuck in the bottom quintile for life and so is your son. The disrepute of a regime, I'm thinking here of course of the Middle East, very youthful regimes, very youthful societies rather, like Yemen today, the existence of a revolutionary ideology, whether it's Bolshevism or radical Islam, and then ethnic disintegration, a theme of my book, The War of the World. Multi-ethnic societies cope much less well with polarization, especially if one ethnic group is seen to do much better than the rest. So assumption A is kind of important, but it needs a hell of a lot of historical qualification before you can use it. Assumption B, that the convergence of GDP between an existing great power and a newcomer will lead to conflict, also needs to be qualified. Conflict mitigators include high levels of public pacifism, the existence of interest groups that are averse to conflict, the existence of international institutions designed to avoid it, and the fact that there are free riding opportunities under a Pax Americana, as there were under the Pax Britannica. Conflict enhancers include the domestic political benefits of saber rattling for weak regimes, the existence of interest groups that have a stake in conflict, or at least a stake in large defense budgets, international institutions, which of course are just as good at causing conflict as preventing it when you come to think about it, and, crucially, a waning hegemon. It's very important to notice how often conflict spikes when an empire is in a state of weakness. We should therefore be very careful about being optimistic about our own imminent future. The mistake that Norman Angell made in 1911 was to conclude that the globalization of the early 20th century made war irrational. It wouldn't happen because the economic costs of war would be too high for the capitalists and indeed for the countries on the up. I want to conclude with a very famous, or not perhaps quite famous in economic circles, but in historical circles, famous conversation. It happened on the 21st of June 1914, and it was between the Kaiser Wilhelm II and the German Jewish banker Max Warburg. The Kaiser hinted at whether it wouldn't be better to strike now rather than wait. He was talking about a potential German attack on Russia. Warburg, and I quote, sketched the domestic political situation in England for him, Irish Home Rule, the difficulties for France of maintaining the 3-year military service period, the financial crisis in which France already found itself, and the probable unreliability of the Russian army. I strongly advised him, Warburg recalled, to wait patiently, keeping our heads down for a few more years. We are growing stronger every year. Our enemies are getting weaker internally. Well, as you know, that advice was disregarded. But it seems to me to have a relevance to our time. In an era of widening inequality within societies, certain regimes will be tempted, either because of the power of interest groups or because of the utility of saber rattling, to pursue aggressive foreign policies. And though those aggressive foreign policies may seem completely economically irrational to economists, not to mention to the people running multinational corporations, they may nevertheless result in very large conflicts. Let me conclude with a challenge for INET. Please do bring new economic thinking to bear on the problems of conflict and stop treating wars as exogenous shocks. They are endogenous to the international system, and those who try to study globalization without studying global conflict are frankly wasting their time. Finally, rescue the world from political science idiocies like the democratic peace theory, which have, I think, already done significant damage to policymaking in this and other countries. And of course, do please support economic historians in this vital work. Thank you very much.